Hello. Hello and welcome everyone to our UDO Update Code Connect 3 Part 2. This is a continuation of the Code Connect that was hosted in October, and we'll continue to explain the rest of the zoning districts that have been drafted to date. So just a reminder, any questions or comments that anyone has related to the content that we shared today, please let us know through the new udo@durhamnc.gov email address, or of course, you can find all of these materials on the project website at engagedurham.com/new UDO. And a reminder to everyone that this is a part 2 of the Code Connect presentation that was provided on October 22nd. You can find that recording on the Engage Durham project website. Here's a screenshot of what that looks like on this slide. And we will be continuing the introduction of the districts that were introduced on that or during that meeting. So during the last meeting on 8/22, we discussed our first major groupings of zoning districts. So that were our residential districts, our residential mixed use districts, and our commercial mixed use districts. Today, we'll be introducing the remainder of the districts within the code so far, and those are our commercial districts, employment districts, institutional districts, and open space districts. So to get started with our commercial districts, we have introduced 3 commercial only zoning districts as part of this effort. Basically from left to right, being left the least intensive in terms of what allows or what types of commercial uses are allowed, to on the right, the most intensive. So the most intense uses that are allowed within our commercial districts. So on the left, commercial neighborhood, CN, is really a neighborhood serving commercial neighborhood district. And it really limits building footprints to 15,000 square feet, doesn't allow for residential uses, really is allowing for things like convenience stores, restaurants, offices, hairdressers, things like that. We will be allowing drive-throughs as part of this draft for that district, but the location of those drive-throughs will be restricted to being either on the side of the building or to the back of the building. So it wouldn't interfere with the streetscape that's happening between the building and the street. Commercial general is sort of our next level up. It's a lot less restrictive than commercial neighborhood, so there's no limit on the size of building footprints, for example. Although this district also does not allow for residential uses, it does allow for more intense commercial uses. So we're thinking instead of a small corner store, now we're thinking more of a big box commercial retail center, or hotels, car washes, auto repair, car sales, things like that. And we are not restricting the location of drive-throughs that come in as part of this district. To the most intense version of this, commercial heavy, or CH, is again the least restrictive in terms of use. So it's although it's still not providing or allowing for any residential uses, it is allowing for things going all the way up to like auto body shops, auto paint facilities, outdoor storage, even some light manufacturing and warehousing and logistics facilities, and other sort of trucking distribution facilities. And again, if any drive-through comes in under this district, it is not restricted. It can be located anywhere on the site. So again, just as a reminder, so taking a step back a little bit, we're looking at these districts related to the place types that the comprehensive plan is trying to implement. So we're trying to implement these districts to be in line with what the community vision is. So commercial neighborhood, that really sort of gentle, small scale commercial district is really going to be implemented within the community institution place type, partially within established residential place type, neighborhood services, and rural commercial. And here's an image of sort of look and feel of what that might look like. Going to our next level up to commercial general, this is really thinking more of like a suburban style shopping center. And unsurprisingly, it is implementing the suburban commercial place type. And then going up to commercial heavy, this is really getting into the general industrial place type, the highway commercial place type, and utility and public works facilities place types. So getting more into that light industrial territory. And so just looking at this on the ground in terms of what you might expect to see for buildings and developments that are built as part of a CN district is a more active facade and streetscape. So you'll notice in this example here, we see a building that is addressing the street, that's has outdoor seating, has sidewalks in front. There's no parking provided between the street and the building front. So any parking that's provided would be in the back or to the side of the building. We're also thinking that this would be a pretty active building. So at least on the ground floor, we would have a build to of an active depth rather, build to an active depth of 40% and 20%. That just means that 40% of the width of that site facing the street would have a building located right up there. And that going 20 feet in from the facade of that building into the building, the depth of that would have 20 feet of habitable space. So things like stores or things where you would have folks spending time and not storing things. And again, just a reminder, the building footprints for this district are limited to 15,000 square feet. So going to the next one up, this image is, we're getting at a better idea of what this district would implement on the ground. This is really facilitating more of a suburban, traditional kind of shopping center place. And so we're not really restricting as much in terms of what the design of this place would look like. You can have pretty much, you can have parking that's happening, in a parking lot that's between the street and the building. We do have an active depth requirement still showing up, but it's would be happening pretty far back in the site. So there would be no, you could really set this building far back. And again, there is no building footprint limit. You can go as large as you want, and parking again is allowed between the building and the street. And so for this last commercial district, these are again really buildings with commercial and light industrial uses in more of an auto-oriented setting. And the image sort of shows a little bit of what that's getting at. So you're starting to see things where you might have a building that's actually set a bit further back from the site, might be screened from the street. It's not necessarily something that would have much of a street presence. We're not requiring there to be active uses in the front of that building. And again, are sort of requiring a bit more of a deeper setback. Again, no building footprint limit on this, and parking is allowed between the building and the street. I will say one of the major differences between commercial general and commercial heavy versus commercial neighborhood is that the height difference is a little bit different. So although you can sort of do a bigger building that's wider and things like that, you can also go a little bit taller in these districts, up to 5 stories, versus in commercial neighborhood, we're really capping that to 3 stories. And so the next set of districts are what we're calling our employment districts. And they include 4, so IX, IH, IU, and IC. And one thing to note about all of these districts is that IX has not been mapped yet. So if you look at a draft of our zoning map, you will not see IX located anywhere. And that's because we really want to have some deeper discussions with the community to understand where this might make sense, but really want to still introduce the district as a concept to see where it might make, if it does make sense to implement in Durham and where. So going from left to right, we have IX, that is industrial mix. That's really intended for transitional or transitioning industrial areas. So this is, we're thinking like really light industrial that might start to introduce things like some residential uses, some commercial uses, and things that would allow for more of an urban fabric. So you can think of apartments on top of artisanal workshops or other types of very low impact, not loud industrial uses, but we would still allow for some things like warehousing and logistics if they meet a certain set of criteria. So Moving further to the right, we have IH, and this is our most intense industrial district, and would be home to the most intense industrial activity in Durham. This is pretty consistent with what Durham would already allow in the equivalent district. So this would be industrial manufacturing activities that would have the most significant impacts, and that would require special measures to ensure that there's compatibility with adjoining properties, whether that's from screening or just other types of use standards. So kind of moving away from that, though, we get into the IU, or Innovation Urban District. And this is really intended to create a mixed employment and sort of a build off of existing tech hubs within Durham, and really sort of continue to expand that within an urban setting. This is something that also probably will be happening mostly when it relates to the Research Triangle Park. It's something that may or may not necessarily be needed in places like downtown Durham, but we'll get a better sense of that when we look at the place types. But generally, this is aligned for things like research, testing, development laboratories, pilot plants, prototyping facilities, and whatnot. And IC really is aligned for a lot of the same uses as IU, but it's in much more of a traditional campus setting. So a lot more open spaces, larger lots, larger buildings probably. So looking at these districts in terms of what place types they're implementing, looking first at industrial mixed use district, although it hasn't been mapped, we generally are seeing that this could be the most applicable to certain areas within community institution, the employment campus, general industrial, perhaps, where some of those uses might be transitioning away from heavier industrial and into lighter industrial, where mixed use is okay. Mixed employment, mixed residential neighborhood, mixed use neighborhood, and potentially in the transit opportunity area place type as well. And of course, looking at heavy or industrial heavy, this is really sort of consistent with how the current heavier industrial districts and zoning works in Durham. So this would be implementing general industrial, resource extraction, and the utility and public works facilities place types. And then innovation urban would be effectively would be a lot closer to the mixed use or industrial mixed use district. So this would be really implementing the employment campus, mixed employment, and transit opportunity area place types. And then for innovation campus, it's really just implementing employment campus. So think RTP. Looking at what this looks like on the ground, going again from left to right, starting with our industrial mixed use district, this is going to look a lot more like a mixed use place where you would see potentially some live work units on the ground floor. It could be maybe some artisanal manufacturing going on with housing above, things like that. We would be generally limiting the height in terms of the base in a similar way that we would be working with, or that the way that we introduce some of our commercial mixed districts, where we're starting in this case at 5 floors rather, for our base, moving up to compact. So if you have smaller units, you can go up a little bit higher. So it's sort of following a more ideally more affordable units that would be developed as part of the market. And then we would then go for more of an unlimited height approach if those units are affordable, and dedicated affordable. The other things across the board in these districts generally stay the same. So height is the major player in terms of what moves around in terms of the base, compact and affordable. A lot of other things sort of remain consistent. But generally, these districts would have, or IX would still have a pretty decent frontage on the street. So you would have a streetscape, potentially could activate that streetscape, things like that. Looking at industrial heavy, this, in terms of design, is something that is really going to be focusing more on screening. So these are things that we're probably not going to want to be seeing too much from the street, and really do require quite a substantial setback from the street. So you can see here that we're showing that a minimum setback of 30 feet so that you would have some really good landscaping and screening between that use and the street. In terms of height, pretty unlikely that we would get buildings coming in at 5 stories in a place like this. But in terms of thinking through some of the equipment that might go in a place like this, like for the example that we're showing here, an aggregate plant for concrete, there might be there might be a need to go up to 5 stories for some of that equipment. And of course, not expecting any sort of presence on the street. So the build to is none, and active depth, there's no requirement. Shifting over into innovation urban, this is going to again look much more like a traditional mixed use building or one of our commercial or CX districts. So a lot of the same standards that you have seen in those districts get carried over here. A lot of street presence, building with limitations so that we don't get, so that we have nice sort of well-distributed, smaller, kind of evolving or changing streetscapes and facades as you walk down the street. So limited to a building width of 250 feet. These buildings are allowed to, or these sites are allowed to have buildings that cover quite a bit of their site. Again, address the street with a pretty substantial build to and an active depth that would be consistent with our other active districts, like CX, for example. And then moving into our last employment district is Innovation Campus. This one, again, is really allowing for a lot of the same uses as Innovation Urban, but is a lot less restricted and it also does require a large front setback, sort of similar to the more intense industrial. So this is really intended to be sort of screened away from the main street, but folks could still provide a building that goes up to 5 stories and wouldn't be required to have too much activation happening on the ground floor. So moving into our next set of districts, this is institutional districts. And at the moment, we're really just looking to introduce the civic zoning district at the moment. And so this is a district that is really intended to accommodate a variety of civic and institutional uses that serve the surrounding neighborhoods in Durham, but don't necessarily assimilate into other zoning districts. It's pretty distinct. So you can think about this as things like schools, places of worship, community centers, hospitals, museums, libraries. And it's really intended to implement the community institution place type from the comprehensive plan. So looking at this on the ground, City Hall is a great example of this district. It's really trying to provide a lot of flexibility to these uses and effectively would be sort of really relating to abutting districts to dictate things like height. So if you're in a neighborhood that has a very low or surrounded by zoning districts that have a very low building height, the civic district in that particular location would also have a very low building height. Other than that, we try to give a lot of flexibility to districts like this. Just don't know what kinds of uses might come in. And then looking at the next or last grouping of districts are open space districts. And these are pretty straightforward. This is our conservation district and our park district. One is a more passive district than the other, but really focusing both of which on either recreation or preservation of nature. So conservation is really intended to create, preserve, and enhance land as permanent open space. And again, focuses on really passive recreational needs of the community if used for recreational purposes, not intended to be occupied by many buildings or paved surfaces, as opposed to a park, which is really, it's also intended to be open space, of course, but is allowed to be a bit more active in terms of meeting recreational needs for the community. So think of park mostly as something that's going to be showing up closer into or within, of course, the urban growth boundary, and conservation being something that happens outside of the urban growth boundary, particularly out in the county. And so for park activities really could include playgrounds, recreational fields, ball fields, sport courts, trails, dog parks, and any sort of associated facilities that would be needed as part of that. So you can think of community centers, libraries, or restroom buildings. And so again, just in terms of what the district or what the district's implementing in terms of its place type, conservation is really implementing, no surprise, rural and agricultural reserve place type, as well as recreation and open space place type. And then park almost exclusively is really just implementing the recreation and open space place type. So looking at conservation on the ground, this image is a pretty good explanation or a good describer of what you would see. Not a whole lot of built stuff, a whole lot of preservation. So we have minimum lot sizes that ensure that this has to be at least 2 acres. We have minimum lot width of at least 100 feet wide. We're not allowing for many buildings on here. We can see that the maximum amount of building coverage you could have on a site like this would be 5%. In the off chance that a building would be needed for restrooms or something like that on a facility like this, we'd be limiting it to 35 feet in height. And that would be, you can think of that mostly as, 2.5 to 3-story building. And then no other restrictions related to building design because really isn't intended to have many buildings in these districts. And then for park, you'll notice this is a bit more of an intensive recreational use that would be allowed here. So here's a great example image of what that might look like. You've got some more pavement showing up. You've got playgrounds, more active recreational uses. You get a little bit more building coverage here. We go up to 15%. That allows for sport facility buildings and whatnot. Same building height limits here. And again, no real building design limitations in terms of how this addresses the street and so forth, sort of like the conservation district. And so that is really all of the additional districts that are included as part of this part 2 of the Code Connect. Again, if you have any questions or concerns about what we've presented as part of this part 2, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at newudo@durhamnc.gov. And of course, this will be posted on the engagedurham.com website /newudo in the same location as the other recordings for the other Code Connects. Thank you so much.